As noted, we had two options for the interpretation of the lachem in this pasuk. The first implied obligation, for which there were two recorded in this pasuk. One, a cessation from melacha, Shabbaton, and a requirement to have a mikra kodesh. The second option was that the lachem is not an obligation, but when applied to the ZICHRON TERUAH, would suggest that the TERUAH, the blowing of the shofar, would be a zichron, a reminder to God, and thereby become a lachem, a benefit to you, the Bnei Israel. We also noted that while this reading of the zichron TERUAH is doable, it is nevertheless not preferable if we have other options. For this reason, Rashi prefers to opt for a consistent interpretation for the lachem, and that just as there's an obligation to observe Shabbaton and Mikra Kodesh, so too there is an obligation to observe the zichron TERUAH. There is, though, a problem in adopting this approach, and that problem is that if we are to link the word zichron to the default translation of Zayin Chaf Reish, to remember, to become aware of, while one can quantify the Shabbaton and the Mikra Kodesh, quantification of zichron TERUAH as an obligation is less straightforward. And furthermore, if on the first day of Tishrei one must observe a Shabbaton, understood to mean a cessation from work, and a Mikra Kodesh, a holy convocation, obviously the nation would be aware of the fact that this is the day of Rosh Hashanah, and a requirement for a zichron TERUAH to be specifically mentioned by Moshe Rabbeinu would appear to be somewhat unnecessary. And for this reason, Rashi looks for the alternative translation for Zayin Chaf Reish, not just an awareness, but an act that will reinforce that awareness. The precedent that he uses for his interpretation would be an earlier use of the Zayin Chaf Reish Shoresh in connection to a mitzvah, the Aseret HaDibrot in Shmot 20, in which Bnei Israel commanded to zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekadosho. Here, once again, we have two options for the Zayin Chaf Reish: a mental activity of remembering, or alternatively doing something that would enhance the awareness of Shabbat. On account of the peculiar vowelling of the term zachor as opposed to zechor, Rashi comments, Tnu lev lizkor tamid et Yom HaShabbat. Set your heart to continually remember the day of Shabbat. She'im nizdamen lecha chefetz yafeh, so that if during the week you come across an attractive object, rather than use it immediately, tehei mazmino l'Shabbat, set it aside for the day of Shabbat. So in effect what Rashi is doing is interpreting the Zachor not just as an awareness of the day of Shabbat, but also quantifying the Zachor, bringing it from mere thought into the real world of action. Similarly, with respect to the obligation of Zichron TERUAH, had the text demanded that there be a Yom TERUAH, then we would apply this obligation to the actual blowing of the shofar. The reality is that the obligation is for a Zichron TERUAH, an obligation to merely become aware of the fact that it is the day of Rosh Hashanah would be unnecessary and lacks quantification. And for this reason, Rashi interprets the words Zichron TERUAH as referring to an act that will enhance that awareness. That on Chodesh HaShvi'i be'echad lachodesh there be a Zichron, a recitation of Pasukim that relate to TERUAH, the blowing of the shofar. These Pasukim are not necessarily focused upon Rosh Hashanah, but rather we have references to Pasukim in which the TERUAH, the shofar, is mentioned throughout Tanakh literature, beginning with Matan Torah and all the way up to the Messianic period, V'haya b'yom hahu yitaka b'shofar gadol.